Hello again. Good to really see those cocktails. I would also love to have fun, to be very honest, but we're going to have one after the next talk, Bruno. So happy to see that all these people are getting these cocktail shakers, but time goes fast. We are almost at the end of the iText customer event here. But last but certainly not least, an important keynote talk where we are all looking forward to. And I would like to introduce to you a person that probably doesn't need to be introduced much, but Bruno, founder of iText, also the very first software developer of iText, writing the first code base. So Bruno, we look really forward to your keynotes, so please take it away.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take you back to the past, and I'm going to talk about the history of open source, and intertwined with this history of open source is the history of iText. Along the way, I'll talk about software business models, so how to monetize open source, because we've been shaking business models since 1998. But before we go to 1998, I have to go to prehistoric times, to the 80s, and I'll talk first about free software. You cannot talk about free software without mentioning Richard Stallman. So Richard Stallman, he worked at MIT together with his colleagues, and they had one printer that was on a different floor from where they worked. And Richard said, well, this is annoying. When we send a print job, we always have to go to that room where the printer is to see if the print job is done. So he changed the source code of the printer, and he made it so that when a print job was done, the person who issued the print job received an email. And then suddenly, that was no longer possible, because the vendor of the printer had made the source code of the printer proprietary and closed source. So Richard could no longer change that source code. And he saw that this was like a trend, that more and more vendors were closing up their source code. And in 1983, he said, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to call it GNU. GNU is not Unix, and it's a recursive acronym, because you can then ask, what is GNU? Well, GNU is not Unix. And he wanted to build an operating system that wasn't proprietary. Today, we all know Linux. That's kind of the result of his project. But if you're ever close to Stallman, to Richard Stallman, don't ever say Linux, because it's the GNU operating system with the Linux kernel. And so he started this project in 1983, and in 1985 he wrote the GNU Manifesto, and he started the Free Software Foundation. Now, one of the concepts that is very important in free software is the concept of copyleft. So we all know what copyright is about. So the moment you write something like a novel or source code, you automatically, as the author, receive the copyright. And the copyright allows you to prohibit others from reproducing, adapting, or distributing copies of your work. And Richard Stallman, he turned this around. You can also see the symbol here, the C, the opening is to the right. Well, he turned the symbol and he said, copyleft, this is the symbol, it's open towards the left. And it reverses everything, because the copyleft gives every person who receives a copy permission, so it's not prohibited, it gets permission to reproduce, adapt, or distribute the work. There's one big condition, and that is you can do so as long as the resulting copies are also available under the same copyleft license. And so the Free Software Foundation created a suite of licenses. We know these as the GPL licenses today, that kind of describe the rules to use software that is released under the copyleft license. Now, free software was not about money. Free software is not a synonym of gratis software. What Richard Stallman used to say is it's free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. One thing that all the GPL licenses issued by the Free Software Foundation need to grant is they need to grant the freedom to run the software, the freedom to study the software, the freedom to change it, and the freedom to redistribute copies. Now, there were some problems with free, in the sense that no matter how much you say it's free as in free speech, not as in free beer, people still perceived it as free of charge. Another problem is that Richard Stallman was perceived as a rather radical person. So his alter ego, Saint Ignatius, was funny. So whenever you went to an event, he put this hard disk as a halo, and then he said, I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. And it was really fun, but himself, he wasn't a saint, to say the least. Another problem is that there was plenty of FUD, so fear, uncertainty, and doubt, spread by companies that saw themselves threatened by free software. For instance, Microsoft, SAP, today they are big advocates of open source, but back then they said, well, free software is communist, it's dangerous, proprietary software is better. As for me, I was introduced to free software by a team at the Flemish government, so I had an assignment at the Flemish government, and there all these people, they were interested in development, not politics. And the reason why we loved free software was because it enabled us to improve the software we used, because we had access to the source code, and it also enabled other people to improve the software that we wrote. And so the goal was to have more openness, more quality, more flexibility, hoping this would result in better software. And so proprietary software has value, but so has free software. And I started writing my first free software library in 1998. It was called RugPDF. I released it under the LGPL. It was not that great, but I'll get back to that later on in my talk. And so I've been talking about free software, and I mistook sometimes because I said open source sometime. So what is open source about? Well, open source, the term open source was first coined in 1998 by Christine Peterson from the Foresight Institute. And so there was a group there with, among others, Eric Raymond and Bruce Perens. They said, well, we need another term because free software is too confusing. And so the moment the term was coined, Eric Raymond and Bruce Perens founded the Open Source Initiative, and they kind of made a list of initially 9 rights, but eventually 10 rights that every open source license should have. And so one of the major differences between the Free Software Foundation and the Open Source Initiative was that the Open Source Initiative said, well, open source and proprietary software can coexist, whereas the Free Software Foundation said all the source, eventually all the software has to be free software. The big breakthrough for open source was thanks to Netscape. So Netscape once was the most popular browser, even more popular than Microsoft Internet Explorer. And they, in 1998, they decided to open source the browser. And for that purpose, they created the Mozilla Public License, one of the many open source licenses. As for me, so I wrote my first free software in '98, so that's when I started writing my first PDF software. And maybe I have to talk about what drove me to do that. So at that time, I worked for Ghent University, and professors, they had a disk with a DOS program on it, so the software only worked on Microsoft DOS. And with this disk, with this program, they could print lists with students. So students of all the courses that they taught, and a means to fill out the grades of the students. Now, these lists could only be printed on an HP printer, and it couldn't be a network printer. And I was asked to kind of rewrite this software for the student administration. And I said, well, we're using Java. Java exists since '95, and we want to produce. I want to produce PDF. PDF exists since '93. I'm going to promise my employer, instead of having to print these lists, I'm going to give you PDF, because PDF, you can open it on a Mac, you can open it on Linux, you can open it on Windows. So I'm going to give them PDF. Unfortunately, what I didn't know was that back then PDF was something that was very much on the desktop, in the sense that people create a document in Word, export it as a PDF, or they use InDesign or Illustrator to create a design, and they export it as a PDF manually on their desktop. What I needed was something that could create PDF on a server, and someone could push a button, and then the PDF would be created without any human intervention. And well, to keep my promise, I had to write my own library. So back then, the PDF reference was only about 600 pages, so that was feasible to read. And I started coding, and I'm ashamed to admit, but I really hated PDF. I hated PDF because it was not like any programming language that I knew, which was normal because PDF isn't a programming language. And so I wrote this code and I released it as open source, and there were some users, but the main problem of RugPDF was that to use it, you had to know the PDF reference. If you didn't have the PDF reference, if you didn't know PDF syntax, you couldn't do anything with it. And so I was the only one at Ghent University who understood my code, and I had to maintain it for more than a year, and then suddenly I saw the light. I saw the light in the sense that, no, I understand why I didn't like PDF. I didn't like PDF because I didn't understand. I didn't like PDF because I didn't understand it. And I asked to my employer, hey, this library I wrote for you, it's really bad. Please stop using it. I want to rewrite it. But my employer said, why fix something if it isn't broken? So I didn't get like the approval to rewrite it. So I rewrote everything from scratch in my spare time. And that's how iText came about. And it was initially released as free software under the LGPL. But then, because of the politics, several users said, well, we cannot use it because it's LGPL. Why don't you release it as MPL? So I also released it as open source software under the MPL. Today, these politics are gone. We talk about free and open source software in one breath. And some people add Libre to the mix, and so FOSS became FLOSS. But personally, I prefer the term FOSS. And so there are many shades of free, and these are some of the licenses. And on this side, you see the more permissive licenses in the sense that you can use software that is released, for instance, under the Apache license in a commercial context, in a proprietary context, without having to meet that many obligations. iText, the original versions, were released under the LGPL and the MPL, which are weak copyleft licenses. Weak copyleft means that you could use iText, the old version, in a proprietary context, but the moment you improved something to the library itself, you were obliged to share you were obliged to share your code with the community. And so the more you go to this side, the stronger the copyleft. So with the AGPL, when you use an AGPL library like iText today, and you distribute it, so you create a software around it, and you distribute that software, whether it's on a download or on a CD or online, so in a network environment, the AGPL kicks in, and you have to release your own code under the AGPL. Now, what about iText? Well, I said in the early years it was MPL, LGPL, and there was no money involved. And people sent me gifts and donations. For instance, someone in Nuremberg sent me Nuremberger cookies to show this is our culture. I want you to taste how these cookies, how these taste. And someone sent me the PDF reference when it came out, PDF version 1.6. Some people sent me DVDs. When my kids had their birthdays, they received boxes of Lego. So these were not financial rewards, but it was nice. My first financial return came from my Google AdSense revenue. So I was an early adopter of Google AdSense. In 2004, I wrote the free online tutorial, and I allowed Google to put ads next to the tutorial, and all the companies that were putting advertisements on the iText site were competitors of iText, but commercial competitors. And so the first years, I had like $1,000 to $1,500 a month. But of course, the more people joined the AdSense program, the lower my revenue was. And so after a couple of years, I had only a couple of $100 a year instead of $1,000 a month. So this was not a sustainable business model. And then my next financial return came from the royalties of my first iText in Action book. Now, I can tell you, you don't get rich writing a book about something technical. And also, even before I received my first paper copy of the book was already bootlegged, and you could already download it from illegal sites. So this was a hobby, not a business. And the more users we started to have, the more my wife and I felt the need, well, we have to found a company, because without a company, no one is going to take iText serious. And so in 2008, we founded the first iText company. It was called 1T3XT BVBA. No one could pronounce that name, but okay. But unfortunately, 2008 was not only the year of the financial crisis, it was also the year our son was diagnosed with cancer. So we spent more time in hospital with our son than we did at our desk. And so we had thousands of users, but no customers. And so 1T3XT almost went bankrupt in its first year of existence. And so one of the other problems was that we didn't have a business model. And people said, sell support, that's going to make you money. There were several problems with that, because there was another company that already sold support. You had OpenLogic. And so the business model of OpenLogic was actually very good. They said, you don't have to buy support from all these different separate vendors. We give support for 400 packages. That's one invoice. That's like a one-stop shop for open source support. So I could not compete with OpenLogic. And another thing, I could not compete with my own nature, in the sense that this is, for instance, a graph of my reputation on Stack Overflow. It only starts in 2012, but even before 2012, I was on many fora and many mailing lists, and I couldn't resist answering questions. I was like, if you throw a ball at the dog can't resist fetching the dog. Well, if you threw a question at me, I couldn't resist answering it. And so selling support for something that I already gave for free was very difficult. Sell professional services, people said. But then I looked at companies like Tata, Northrop Grumman, DXC, which was called CSC back then. They had more people, more money, more everything than me. So how could I, as a single developer, compete with those companies? I thought, well, these companies already introduce iText with their customers. Instead of competing with them, they could be my best ambassadors. They could kind of sell iText to their customers for me. And also, every hour that I spend on professional services is an hour that I cannot spend on product development, so I never took the path of professional services. I was more or less caught between the zombies and the vampires. On one hand, you had the diehards who said, intellectual property is evil, we want your brain. On the other hand, you had like big corporations like Google and Amazon who were using iText and who said, well, open source is free, we are never going to pay you, we want your blood. And I was caught in between, and I said, I'm an open source developer, I want to live too. And so the solution was to go from free and open source software to commercial open source software. And so a friend of mine, Andrew Binstock, he founded iText Software Corporation in the US in 2009. We didn't have any employees, but we worked with with a couple of salespeople on commission, Michael Bradbury and Kevin Brown back then. And I noticed that customers in the US understood the business model. And what was the business model? The business model was dual licensing. In 2009, we changed from the MPL LGPL, you remember the weak copyleft licenses, we changed to the AGPL, so the stronger copyleft. And we said, well, companies can use iText for free if they meet the conditions of the AGPL, which could involve that they have to make their own source code available. If they don't want to do that, they can be released from the obligations of the AGPL by purchasing a commercial license. So the first revenue for iText was generated with perpetual licenses. Back then, we sold licenses for a one-time fee with a yearly maintenance fee of 20%. And in return, you received premium support. You could kind of help us prioritize our roadmap. So back then, I developed whatever I felt like developing. But once we had customers, we listened to the customers who said, well, we would like this functionality. And so by becoming a customer, they were funding the development of whatever functionality they needed. We slowly tried to move towards capacity rental, so a subscription, where you pay a yearly fee based on volume. And so one of the evolutions that has happened is we went from 100% perpetual license back in 2009 to today 100% capacity rental licenses or subscription licenses. In 2011, so the guys like Michael Bradbury, Andrew Binstock, Kevin Brown did a really good job. And in 2011, we decided to import the success from the US to Europe. And we founded iText Software BVBA. We also changed the name from 1T3XT, no one could pronounce that, to iText Group NV. So we had iText Group NV and then an iText software in California and in Massachusetts and an iText software in Belgium. I'm going to skip a couple of years now. And so the success was kind of materialized in 2014 when we won the Belgian edition of Deloitte's Fast 50. We were the fastest growing technology company in Belgium, and we were ranked 28th place in the EMEA region. What did we use our revenue for? Well, we professionalized the company. We hired more employees, so put the foundations under iText to make sure that iText is here to stay. We further developed the library, so based on user comments, but also closely following new PDF functionality. That's very important, for instance, in the world of digital signatures when security is involved, that you always use the latest specifications. We gained expertise by becoming a member of the ISO committees for PDF, so we used to follow the specs. Now we started writing them. And we expanded globally in the sense that we went to conferences and events all around the world. We also started iText Software Private Limited in Singapore. So we became part of a commercial open source software ecosystem, and we were constantly adapting the product and the business model to changing times. For instance, today you have the iText suite, and so that started with iText 7. We love free and open source software, and we like the idea of keeping the core library open source, but some functionality requires plenty of work, and well, we asked ourselves, is it wise to give such valuable assets away for free? So starting with iText 7, we decided to offer proprietary add-ons. And for instance, PDF Calligraph, you see here the result of PDF Calligraph in the background, is one of those add-ons. We also noticed that we are not the expert of everything. There were developers who were using iText in ways that we could never have imagined. Why not give them a platform to monetize their experience? And so starting with iText 7, we also decided to offer third-party add-ons, so add-ons developed by people who are not iText developers or iText employees, and we branded them as an iText product, and then we shared the revenue. PDF to Data, that was mentioned today many times, started as a third-party add-on. Today, iText bought the source code, and it's a standalone product owned by iText now, but historically, it started as a third-party add-on. We also noticed, well, iText doesn't have a UI, so it was created as a library that lived on the server. And we said, well, let's lower the threshold for adoption and develop a new product, iText Ditto, designing interactive templates online. And so the idea was to create a template in an in-browser application, put the template on a server, throw some data at it, and get a PDF in return. And so back then, when we came up with the name, that was still an idea. Today, it's an actual product, and I'm very happy to see that it materialized, that the ideas that I had back then materialized. So to summarize, open source is very much alive, and everything that lives also evolves. I have put here some of the key dates for iText, and there's one thing that I didn't mention yet. So now, today, iText is part of a much larger PDF family. So it was acquired by PDF Tron, that also acquired Active PDF and Windward Studios. So you see kind of a consolidation of PDF technology there. And another way to look at a summary of my talk is, well, these are 8 different ways that you can use to monetize open source. But these 3, the gifts and donations, the ad revenue, selling books and documentation, well, they are not that sustainable. Professional services, we always stayed away from this, but perpetual licenses, subscriptions, and proprietary closed-source add-ons, those were the ones that worked for us. And maybe, who knows, in the future, software as a service would also be a great way to monetize open source. So what does the future hold for iText? Well, when a company grows, like I grew iText, there are 2 options. Either the company gets acquired, as was the case with iText, multiple times, more than once, or the company acquires other companies, which is what PDF Tron did. And so it's normal for the original founder to take a step back, which is what I did. But now I'm very happy because I know that in the hands of PDF-tron, I think that iText is really in good hands. Now, what does the future hold for me? So maybe you wonder, what is Bruno doing today? Well, I'm realizing my childhood dreams. I always wanted to be a writer, and now I write short stories. Several of my short stories have been published in anthologies by Dutch publishers. And I studied architectural engineering, so I'm a civil architectural engineer. And my wife and I, we bought a movie theater, and that's our main project now. This is a picture of the movie theater in the 50s. It didn't have much love in the last 30 years, so my main project now is renovating a movie theater in the historical center of Ghent. If you liked this talk, if you say, well, I want to know more about the history of iText, the history of open source, I have put this down in much more detail in my book, Entrepreneur, Building a Multi-million-dollar Business with Open Source Software, and here's the URL where you can find it. So I see that I was a little bit too fast, but I don't think you mind, because maybe it's time for another cocktail in a moment.